Welcome to Leaders and Legends, the podcast focused on leadership and clinical trial execution. I'm your host, Patty Lushton, CEO of Diligent Pharma. In each episode, we'll get to know the individuals who are driving change and influencing the direction of our industry. Whether you're a seasoned executive yourself, an emerging leader, or simply passionate about clinical trials like I am, join us as we discuss our industry's most pressing challenges, the future of clinical trials, and hear insights and advice from the leaders who are moving our industry forward. Ken, welcome to Leaders and Legends. I'm very excited to talk with you about your leadership journey and also discuss the leadership framework that you developed. So welcome.
Delighted to be here.
And, for our listeners and our viewers, I just want to describe that this interview will actually be in two parts. And this first segment will focus on Ken and the work he's doing now, his career journey. We'll also provide some context for the leadership framework that Ken has developed. And then segment two, we're actually going to dive into the material. So, and I've had a sneak peek of this work, and it's very interesting, and I'm just really looking forward to getting into it. And I know this time will go by very, very quickly. So I just want to get started, and I think, Ken, maybe the best place to start is to first talk about the work that you're doing now with CMPartners, with the Global Restoration Institute. So can you describe that work?
Great. So I'm splitting my time. And first, thank you for this opportunity.
Of
I'm a
course.
little bit intimidated that it's leaders and legends. So maybe I'm in the first category, right?
No, you're
But
both. You are both. People will get to understand that after we we get into it here a little bit.
So I'm spending my time now in two different areas. CMPartners is a firm I started 25 or so years ago, in and around the area of conflict, in and around the area of negotiation. It emanated out of the Harvard Negotiation Project, where I was many, many years before. Roger Fisher, who wrote this book, Getting to Yes, was my mentor and partner. But the work now focuses on negotiations on conflicts, and it is helping companies and governments deal with conflict, manage conflict, try to resolve conflict, try to even transform conflict. And we can talk a little bit about conflict management versus conflict transformation, if and as that's interesting. And that work, again, is coaching, it is running negotiation workshops, it is mediating, it is facilitating difficult conversations, difficult disputes, it's advising on an important negotiation.
And you have done some work in the pharma industry with CMPartners. Is that right?
It is true that I have over the years, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Have over the years have worked with
Mhm.
different companies, many of the major pharma players,
Mhm.
either purely on how to negotiate, and it could be negotiate as a pharma company with a startup who has a potential product, a potential who wants to do a deal. It could be with, it has been with suppliers. It has been with the government, things like negotiating pricing. So
Okay.
multiple different lenses in the pharma world. And then the second place I'm spending my time, which essentially came out of CMPartners, or some of my experiences at CMPartners. I started a not-for-profit now 6, 8, 12 months ago, called the Global Restoration Institute. Basic premise of the GRI is that we, humanity, we people, organizations, governments, societies, don't know how to deal well with the wounds of the past, that we have hurt each other in many cases. And since we don't really know how to do well with it, it then sits underneath conflict, it sits underneath polarization, and it leads to many of the things we're seeing in the world. And that GRI's focus is basically to say we need to help leaders understand and transform the wounds that are problematic in order to create healthier relationships, healthier societies, And it's not doing it at an individual level, it's doing it at a societal level. So, the GRI, we're working in Rwanda. We're helping in Rwanda, the Ministry of Justice, embed trauma informed. I use the word wounding so far. Some people like the word trauma instead.
Mm.
We're helping
Mhm.
in Rwanda, the Ministry of Justice, embed principles of trauma principles into their justice system. If you have a lot of trauma in a society, it leads to negative health outcomes. It leads often to more criminality. And if you re-traumatize criminals, then you don't sort of help rehabilitate. So in Rwanda, we're working with the Ministry of Justice. I've been working in the Middle East with government officials uh, uh, to, and these are in some conflict situations. I can't really talk about where, but in
Yeah.
certain conflict situations to help these ministers and the governments both manage in a traumatized society their ministries. How do you lead an organization where I, as a minister, might be traumatized? My ministry, the people
Mm.
working might be exhibiting trauma, and then my society is being traumatized. How do you bring some of those principles forward? And then the final thing I'll say on this is, which is interesting and exciting, because it may be interesting to people here, is trying also. I'm developing now some ideas around how to embed some of these ideas in in the 250th anniversary of America. So, as you
Oh,
know, in
wow.
July it's our 250th birthday, and have developed some ideas around how to improve civic conversations in the United States and use our birthday as a way to
Mm.
do it because I just as I don't think it's a surprise to anyone. The quality of our conversations in our country now are not where we want them to be, right? People are not speaking with each other because of
Exactly.
political divides, etc. And we're working now on how do we contribute to our anniversary. And if that's of interest, I could talk more about what it is, but those are examples of GRI work.
Wow. Well, it's such a important mission. It's so big,
It is a big
in
mission.
terms, and it's, especially, and it's timely given everything that's going on in the world. And, I've talked with a number of people about the work that you're doing, because I'm in awe of it.
Well,
And, it's interesting because so many people that I've mentioned the work to will say, "Oh, have you ever heard of Thomas Hubel?" Almost every person who is interested in the whole area of generational trauma will always bring his
Thomas,
name up.
right. And
Yes,
Thomas is
and
my partner in GRI.
yes.
It's
I
Thomas.
wanted to ask you how you connected with him.
I was in the US government, and I can describe that to you. And Thomas came to the United States X number of years ago and had an interest in contributing on Israeli Palestinian issues. And he was introduced to me as someone who had worked on, I still do work on Israeli Palestinian issues.
Mhm.
And I met him, and he's Austrian. I have a sort of Austrian and German background. So we had that sort of personal connectivity, but then got intrigued as I listened to him talk about his work around my view that the trauma work had not been integrated into the negotiation conflict world. And that was a big problem. And so we started a conversation and um, over a number of years started exploring the intersection of negotiation conflict work and collective trauma work and trauma healing, and came to a not surprising conclusion that there was enormous potential power if we brought our work together. If we
Mm.
brought our work together, sometimes very explicitly saying, let's work on the collective trauma of this society. But in many of the cases where I work, you cannot enter the conversation through the past. People don't want to
Yeah.
I don't wanna deal with the past. I'm not gonna engage the
Right.
conversation. So, in those cases, I enter from the future, not from the past.
That's
And
you know,
the conversation becomes more of a conversation around where do we wanna go together, we who are divided now? Let's talk about what potential futures are, and then the past comes up in the context of where we're going, as opposed to saying, "I'd like to now have a conversation with you about healing trauma," because a lot of people will resist that,
yeah,
uh,
right.
immediately.
Yeah, so that was one of my questions because I was so curious about how you address this because of potential triggering, right? Like,
Right.
yeah, very interesting to focus on uh sort of a vision, right, for the future and enter the conversation that way.
Yeah, and, it's something that has become a little bit more clear to me. It was less clear to me even 5 years ago, is this question around when there's a problem patty in front of you, and there are 3 time frames that you can engage: the present,
Mm,
the future, or the past. Is I don't think people are thoughtful enough around what time frame should be the initial entry into this conversation of the problem. The presenting
mm,
problem and the symptoms of the problem and what people are talking about, and do you spend a lot of time analyzing it, or do you just use it as a bridge to talk about where you wanna go pretty
right.
quickly, and
Yeah.
then spend more time on where we wanna go as opposed to where we are, and then make decisions around when and how you then engage how we got here. And if people aren't thoughtful enough about that, very often where we are now triggers an unhelpful conversation around how we got there, which becomes more of a blame conversation. And then the conversation spins in the present problem, blame about how we got there, and it's just not helpful and not useful. And so
Yeah.
sometimes, again, just being more thoughtful about, let's bridge from present to future. Let's then build some connectivity, build some shared energy, shared possible momentum, and then let's thoughtfully engage how we got there, and not again with a blame frame, right? Because sometimes, again, the
Mm,
conversations of the past are your fault, my fault, you did this, et cetera, which again are a little bit less helpful. So again, sort of a
yeah.
diversion, but I think those are, I think this question of if there's a problem today, which frame do you go in and how long do you spend there is like a simple question, which I don't think people are thoughtful enough about it.
I it's yeah, it's so true, and it's interesting that it applies to these, conversations that you're having, with governments about, you know, global conflict, but it also could apply to, personal relationships and
Absolutely.
one-on-one interactions as well. Um
Yeah, absolutely. And it also it, it it is the more emotional the situation, the more important it is to be thoughtful about it, right?
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
if it's just sort of a technical and or analytic and or we're having a difference and everyone's very
Yeah.
calm, then whichever time frame I talk about is a little bit less
Yeah,
relevant.
right.
But
Yeah.
when emotions are involved and people have been hurt, um, I think it's really important, right? It's
Mhm.
really important. And the last thing I would also say about this is that talking about the past also requires a honoring where people are, right? Honoring where people
Mhm.
are, because some of the patterns of behavior around how people have dealt with pain or wounding, they're doing it because that's how they feel safe. And you need to be thoughtful and deliberate about it, as opposed to saying, "All right, we've talked about the present. Now let's talk about the future. Okay, now let's talk about the past. Share all your deepest, darkest." It's not very sensitive and can be re-traumatizing itself. So it takes some
Yeah.
skill to manage this.
Yeah. Well, I have so many questions, but I I want to spend a little time on the work that you did at Harvard with the
Yeah.
Harvard Negotiation Project. And I don't know if you remember this, Ken, but when we first met 6 years ago, which was sort of serendipitous, we happened to both be in Park City,
Park City.
Utah
Yeah.
at the same time. And I was I was with my friend, our mutual friend, Cindy Learn. I think that's kind of how we bonded because I was telling you that the book Getting to Yes was one of the early business books that I read with when I started my first company, Avoca, and uh, really leveraged the principles and the models in that book in a very practical way
Yeah.
with the work that we were doing. Yeah, we had done some work with J&J to help them sort of whittle down their list of 70 or 80 suppliers to 10, and um, we introduced the concept of actually interviewing the individuals that they were about to go into a negotiation with to understand their point of view, their interests. So, as a neutral third party, getting as much information as possible about what these CEOs of the CROs actually cared about.
Right.
And at first, I was like, why would we do that?
Right.
But it was very well received. And so, and of course, many other examples of how I've personally leveraged that work. But can you talk a little bit about those early days and then also how it was sort of maybe foundational for, the work you're doing now and the work you've done over the years in your career?
Yeah. So I had the benefit of being at in law school with Roger Fisher, the author of Getting to Yes, when the book was still in manuscript form. And I took the winter negotiation workshop in the winter of 1981, which shows you how experienced I am. I was in law school in 1981. And this was the 3-week period during which the Iranian hostage crisis, Iran is in the news today.
Yes.
This was just before Reagan would take office on January, whatever it was, the 20th, 1981. And we had Getting to Yes as a manuscript. It was not a book yet. It had no name. We named it.
Mm,
And we would read each chapter and then we would edit the chapter and then we'd negotiate. And while we were doing that, Roger was working with Cyrus Vance and also advising Algerian students who were mediating between the United States and the Iranians. And then, of course, it all that negotiation succeeds. The hostages are released. The American hostages are released, and but it becomes it was like this extraordinary academic experience where I saw ideas live
mm,
work.
amazing.
And then I was like the first associate of the Harvard Negotiation Project. The Harvard Negotiation Project had just started. And this was there were no companies. Getting to Yes was not published. It then gets published 82, 83, somewhere in that area. And then Roger assembles his students, and we were all doing different things. I was working at Bain Company. Like the first chapter of my career after law school was working at Bain just as a management consultant, which was a fantastic experience. But then Roger brought together students from different places, and then we started and worked had a public and a not-for-profit, and that's where I spent 20 or so years from 1989, 1990 to 2010 working in and around the negotiation area. It's before you had in many universities like PhDs in conflict, but we basically learned and codified and failed, and we were
Mm,
young, and we would work on an international conflict and teach, and people would say, "What are you talking about? That won't apply here." But so it was this humbling, um, which is of course great career trait to be humble and learn. But we learned and codified and improved, and that sort of foundation of lots of thoughtfulness and skill, of course, much to learn around how you deal with difference, around how people manage conflict, around are you trying to transform it, around how do you rebuild relationships. That is the foundation for both GRI and the work we're doing. And also that some of the ideas of getting to yes, which I find incredibly useful, were insufficient to actually
Mm.
deal with some of the problems, right? And part of that insufficiency was the fact that sometimes getting into your interests and coming up with a creative solution and maybe something that's fair and appropriate based on objective criteria for those people who want to we can do a quick negotiation workshop. Uh,
Mm.
sometimes do not transform the relationships. And so
Ah,
it's a very effective way to negotiate a more optimal, more creative deal to get at what parties care about and to be creative. And though it sometimes doesn't, I don't think getting the yes is sufficient in its articulation around if I need to, what is the consequence of not transforming do I leave the relationship in place and do the deal? Do I manage the conflict? Right? Do I come up with a transaction? But if the two parties don't like one another, I haven't fundamentally changed their relationship with each other. And therefore, I've effectively managed or resolved this particular transaction, but the vendor company relationship is still
mm.
um, shift. It's not positive. There's a lack of trust between the parties, and that piece of if you need to transform the relationship is something I don't think getting to yes does enough on, which is again part of GRI is to say, and part of other work that I've been doing is to say, well, what happens if I want to not manage the conflict, but I want to transform it? If I want to change
I see.
fundamentally the relationships. And again, the business applications of this are you run an organization and you have two heads of units who have a bad interpersonal relationship and you're the leader, right? I can manage and or resolve the immediate conflict between them, but leave in place the relationship issue they have with them, and therefore it repeats, right? and
Right.
and
Yes.
and these are decisions that I have to make, and I'm not suggesting every single time you need to go and transform the conflict, but I do think some people or some leaders manage, this is also true in the international context, people manage conflicts, they don't push to transform them, and therefore they repeat, right?
Right.
New
And
issue
it
between them.
and it's really because the transformation is really the hardest part, right? You could apply all these theoretical principles and everybody's on board, but um, I would imagine it takes a certain level of emotional intelligence to even enter into that work.
I,
Is
I
that
think
true?
I think it is true. It takes more skill. It takes more skill. And again, it doesn't mean that every single person you should always try to transform those conflicts. But if one does a diagnostic and says, for instance, whether it's an external supplier, it's a customer, it's somewhere inside the company, and there's a relationship or trust issue or respect issue, whatever its nature, a relational issue between company, vendor, company, customer, internal. If you don't, and is that kind of relational problem, you're making a decision not to try to transform it, right?
Mhm.
And
Right.
maybe you can.
The passivity is actually a
It's a
decision,
decision,
right?
right? And
Yeah.
and you embed future problems, and maybe you don't have the emotional skill or don't have the bandwidth or it's inappropriate, but then maybe you need to ask for help, and there are people who can help. There are people can
Yeah.
help. I'm watching some of the conversations now without going through any of the details, between the US government and certain companies, right? Between the US government and certain companies. And
Mhm.
there are clear relationship issues now that are very, very explicit. And again, people need to make decisions around, if should I try to engage the renegotiate the transaction, and or how might I conceptualize I want to rethink my relationship? And then, and then again, if this is of interest, we can go maybe next time go through more details around this. Is I've also been, I was fascinated by differential knowledge around one-on-one relationships and even organizational relationships. Some people are very thoughtful about saying, this is a multiple player in there, a bunch of us and a bunch of them. And
Yeah.
sometimes the senior leaders have a good or a bad relationship, or there are different issues in different places. But sometimes I need groups to rethink their relation. This is back to almost more GRI stuff, right? But there are
Mhm.
groups and there's more complexity in the relationships. But again, long and short of it, I think this is an important decision people need to make. And then we can apply it to our, the United States right now. Whole groups have relationship issues with each other. There was a recent poll I saw which said that America now has more people who dislike the person with different political views than almost anyone in the world, right? So not only do we disagree, but it has now moved to people don't like each other. And that's like a fundamental
Yeah.
structural problem in our country that, in my view, needs to be addressed because, we can have conversations about i- many things where we might actually have shared views because we don't like each other, we don't trust each other, we speak ill of each other. And again, it's not a way to, in my view, to run a democracy, to run a productive society, because the problems we're facing are too big.
I agree. Yeah, and it's only intensified. Yeah, it's a great segue into your, leadership essentials work. The one thing has come to mind though that I wanted to touch on, and that's, we've done work with so many different types of companies in the life sciences space, and a lot of the work we did in my previous organization was around relationship management. And do you find that when you're working with leaders and there are these situations where there are internal conflicts, the attitude is like, well, you know what? They just have to figure it out.
Yeah.
These two leaders, they're grown-ups. This isn't, I'm not their therapist. They just need to figure it out. We have work to do here. Is it sort of brushed under a rug? I, I kind of have seen it, but I wondered what your experience is with that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I can never tell it is if it's a lack of awareness of the consequences of the relationship issue and the fact that it's not likely they're going to work it out, right? And or
Mhm.
whether it is the leader just saying, um, the leader not having skill around it, right, and not even wanting to try to deal with it. So there are, I think, different diagnoses, and uh, if that's your approach, okay, fine. But if it happens again, and it happens again, then not fine, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's one thing they work it out, and maybe they do work it out, but if it sort of repeats, you as a leader are building a structural barrier to execution and strategy. And aside on this, Monitor, a consulting firm with whom I've had a long experience of working with different consulting firms. Their strategy model, which I found extraordinary, they added this, and we can talk about this if and as it's of interest. They had a strategy model which talked about you need to have congruence between the positioning logic, the strategy of a business, the operating context of a business, and how the business invests resources. All right. And all that makes
Mm,
conceptual
yeah.
sense. You looked on the operating context, and they talked about culture and systems and structures, but they explicitly added a circle which were interpersonal relationships, right? So they actually
Mm,
added into a analytic approach to consulting that sort of interpersonal relationships are something that have to be on the mind of a leader, because if those interpersonal relationships are wrong, I can have a beautiful written strategy with a wonderful set of org structures, and I can have brilliant governance and decision making. Everything on paper can look just beautiful, but Bill cannot get along with Betty and or um, Roger, and
Mhm.
those interpersonal dynamics can shape how the company or organization sees the world, how they diagnose the problem, what possible,
Yeah.
what solutions are there, how it gets executed, et cetera. So I think it's an important variable in leadership.
Yes, all of that has ripple effects to culture and,
Right.
um, whether you have a healthy, winning culture or a dysfunctional culture. So I really want to get into sort of the context of the
Right.
leadership essentials, and we've talked about this VUCA squared model that is so interesting, and I wonder if you could start by
Right.
describing that.
Great. And before I do, just I want to add just one thing, which is where the whole model came from was I've described to you up until 2010. So chapter one of my life was Bain Company. Chapter two of my career was CMPartners negotiation. Chapter three was I joined the US government. And I
Yes.
became essentially the chief operating officer of an organization called the International Trade Administration, 2,000 person organization. The commercial sections of embassies globally reported to me. But I moved from consultant, and even though I had been a leader of firms, it was the first time I ran a big organization, and I consider 2,000 people a big
Yes.
organization, right? So it's a big
Yes.
organization, and and I moved from advising to being the decider. And without going through all the details, this leadership model I'm going to describe to you is basically what I reflected back on my whole career. All right. And I reflected of when I was in the leadership role, what were practical ideas, very practical, very pragmatic, very on the ground practices that I found helpful, and some of them were stuff I knew from my negotiation world. But then I also reflected back on what I didn't know that I thought would have been really helpful. And this
Mm.
model is it's like a practitioner's framework, right? It's a practitioner's framework. It's not like a theoretical model. Because again, my experience is, and I do a lot of coaching now, um, is there's like stunning amount of fantastically good leadership writing, but you can't keep up with it, right? Every week every month the Harvard Business Review comes up with X number of things, and I get this management tip. I can't keep up with all of it. And so what I also tried to do here was to create 10 buckets that people could look at and then maybe they say, I don't need to spend, I'm pretty good at this, I want to go over there, but sort of 10 practical sets of ideas, practices. So that's sort of the context of this. All right. So then the quick description of it, and then we'll come back to this, is and I've sort of framed it around VUCA, is the basic idea is that it is way tougher now to manage than it ever has been, and it continues to be. Um, and VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, are ideas that came from the Army War College in 1987 at the end of the Cold War. And basically the whole notion was, the political world was more structured, right? There was more certainty to it. And the end of the Cold War, they coined this term volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, right? So just from a definitional point of view, that the world is likely to change suddenly and unexpectedly and often for the worse. That there's a lot of uncertainty. We just don't know that which will occur. It's a more complex world, many interconnected parts and variables, and ambiguous. There's a lot of lack of clarity about things. And then what I said was, I think there was a good definition in '87, but it's 40 years later, and I think it's much tougher than this. So then to give it some name, I called it VUCA squared, right? Or VUCA
Mhm.
plus or VUCA cubed, but call it VUCA squared. And I said, so leaders today are not only in a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, but they also are in a world where it's faster, there's more velocity, and things
Mhm.
happen virally, right? Things can happen fast and explode, right? It's not only uncertain, but a lot of people feel unsafe. And it's also an untrusting world. We have sort of lost our trust in institutions, our trust in each other. It's not only complex, but there's chaos, right? There's literally things change, and it's not, oh, this is a difficult world to understand. If I spend more time thinking, no, we live also with chaos. And then I think it's also a more anxious world. There's all this data on that more and more people are feeling anxious about the future. And now we even have AI, right? So I then added and
Yes.
said, so the management challenge is even more. And therefore, if one were to say, how do I think about what leaders need to do to be able to manage this extraordinary difficult world, an ever shifting world? And then I came up with these 10 practices. And so that people can process them in a way, or remember them in a way, I group them into three categories. How do you lead yourself? What are the practices that a leader needs focused this way that are foundational for them to be able to interact well with others and to lead an organization, right? So some leaders are so externally focused, right? It's all about the
Yes.
mission of the organization, about how I engage the management team, the conflicts. There's insufficient time spent internally. And if there are problems internally, it shapes everything else. So the first bucket is how you lead, how you manage yourself. And so again, it was more manageable. I framed it, or said there are three R's: reflecting, regulating, and refreshing, right? Reflecting, regulating, restoring. And again, at the simplest, it says, what are the practices that I need, and the practices I need to do to promote clear thinking, clarity in my mind? All right. And one is reflecting. How do I think about, what assumptions do I make? What beliefs do I have? Regulating, again, we'll talk more about this next week, is how good am I at regulating my nervous system, right? Do I react? Am I angry? Am I frustrated? I spend each day, all day at work, frustrated at the fact that people don't do things fast enough, right? Or don't do it in the way I want it done. And my nervous system is constantly activated. And we'll talk Monday around what are the consequences of that. One of the consequences of being dysregulated is I have lower cognitive skill. I'm actually not at my best when I'm
Mm.
frustrated. And then finally, one which is a incredibly important to me is this question around the degree to which leaders take care of themselves, and spend enough time thinking about how do I refresh myself. And that's both around burnout, but it's also around their ability to be at their best when it matters most. And I have given up trying to persuade leaders to take care of themselves because they're going to burn out, although I think that's true. But now at least more powerful argument I'm at least trying to make is to sit there and say, hey, look, there are a whole bunch of issues you've got to handle during a day. You need to be at your best at
Yeah.
to handle some of them. And I promise you, if you don't sleep enough, and if you don't exercise enough, and if you don't manage your stress, you will not be at your best. So that's bucket
Right.
A. That's bucket A. Bucket B is, the leader and how the leader engages others. And I try to
Yeah.
summarize this into four practices: communicating with curiosity and clarity. So the leader as listener, but then also the leader holds a responsibility to fill vacuums in people's minds about things. And,
Mhm.
many people, there's a lot of change in the organization. People are worried about their jobs. They're worried about the strategy. They're worried about the directions. People's minds fill with things. And part of what the leader also has to do is not only listen, which again, we can talk more about it, but also how clear the leader is in how they communicate. Engaging conflict, the simplest way of saying this is there are a limitless number of conflicts or differences that exist as you run an organization. It can be with external parties, it can be inside. And the leader
Mm.
is the person who models how you engage conflict. Harvard Business Review in the last couple of months wrote about the conflict intelligent leader. So, again, I would argue good leaders are people who know how to manage and engage conflict constructively. The leader, the relational leader, if a lot of people are nervous and a lot of people are afraid, and it's important, as we talked about what some of the relationships are, the leader needs to be a connector. The leader needs to be very good at both building connections, building deeper connections, repairing corrections, and then co-creating was framed as, since the work unit in many organizations is the team, how does the leader create, lead, support teams as a work unit?
Mm.
All right. Um,
Mhm.
and so self is about promoting clarity of mind. Others is around how you enable collective intelligence and collective action as a leader. And then the third is then you leading, or the leader as now framed as leading the organization. And this is now me combining, many, many years in different places, is how you think about setting strategy in an ever-changing world. And that I actually don't find to be a very easy analytic question, right? The years of the 5-year strategic plan, helpful, but if the world is changing all the time, AI is transforming businesses. It's just not clear to me how you think about a 5-year plan. And though I still think setting direction is a core component of a leader. And that's so what I've embedded here are some best practices around how you set strategic direction in an ever-changing world. Shaping systems and culture is, how do I make certain that my organization is structured, governance structures, decision-making structures, the organization of the culture of the organization aligns with the strategy. And then the final word, and then we'll pick it up in our next piece, is more than any other, is the leader also needs to be a steward. And that steward idea around the short and the long term, um, burning demands of the urgent, the
Mm.
burning demands of today and tomorrow, but then also thinking around, what do I need to do to protect the organizational capacity? What I need to do to really be thinking about how to protect the culture of the organization. And so that is sort of the last piece. And then I framed, at least the organizational piece is around how I align strategy, systems, culture for execution at scale. Right? That was sort of my
Yeah.
my frame, which is a little bit different than I'm interacting with my executive team. And then this is then offered, these 10 practices are then offered as, you need to be doing these, and these maybe become buckets where different people could look at and say, I need to spend a little bit more. I think I'm incredibly good and incredibly reflective, and I'm pretty good at regulating my nervous system, but maybe I need to spend more time there. Or I can get a
Mm.
little bit better around being clear about my communication, or maybe a place I should work a little bit more on is on the relational side, the connecting piece, or it's interesting questions around strategy and how you think about strategy. This is offered as these sets of practices that is at least my draft of what people need to do. And I'll
Yes.
stop and
Well, we're running up on time. I have so many questions. This is such interesting work, and it's such an elegant model, but it also feels very practical. And the way you've broken it into these 3 segments and then these 10 sort of practices or principles, I think is just very accessible, right? So it's
That
not
was at least the hope.
overwhelming.
Yeah.
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 And Ken, this must be incredibly gratifying for you just to have it feels to me from all we talked about today and from what I know about you, that it's almost like a culmination, right, of many years of uh, experience and um, situations that have been, sort of profound in and of themselves, just in the nature of the work that you do, and to sort of bring it all together in one model, uh, must be pretty exciting for you personally.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you're exactly right that it's a way for me to it's like, I thought of these chapters, right? If Bain was the first chapter and
Yeah.
negotiation was the second chapter and government service was the third chapter and the fourth chapter was these years since I left, which was integrating. This fifth chapter now is trying to distill and share, right? As
Mhm.
a way of trying to make more accessible some of ideas which I think are helpful in a difficult world, right? In a very difficult
Yes.
world in which we live. And so if this is, if this is a way of helping a leader be more effective and then therefore create a different kind of organization or different kind of it's yes, you're exactly right. It is gratifying to try to codify it. And it's also humbling in the sense that it always feels like it's a draft, right? And
Mm.
I think that in this world, that's also another good idea is that the sort of the willingness to um, continue to adapt it and continue to sort of view it as a learning exercise is also
Right.
the right stance, because I think the world keeps changing, and I also think different people can fit this into their style differently, right? This doesn't
Mhm.
presume the leader needs to be a blank, right? It's
Yeah.
saying you need to be thoughtful about how you're listening and how you're communicating, and you need to reflect and regulate your nervous system, right? That's good for you, and you need to take care of yourself, right? And you need to be thoughtful about articulating a direction that's helpful for your organization, and you need to have the guts to articulate that direction. And for me,
Mm.
part of strategy setting also is making choices, right? Agreeing on what the organization's not going to do. And those are hard things to do, but they're incredibly helpful for an organization. And so, yeah, different people might
Yes.
pick different pieces of this out.
Right.
And I sometimes always joke about all these kind of things. If you don't like the others bucket, throw the others bucket out, right? And just say, I like that regulation refresh piece. So different people can
Yeah.
reach differently here depending on their interests. So
Well, it's very rich, and I'm really looking forward to getting into it a layer deeper
great,
when we talk next. So,
great.
Ken, thank you so much for
Thanks for the
spending the time
opportunity.
today.
Thanks for the opportunity.